Joins us. Hey, Dan, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you guys?
We're good. So, how did you do? I think your picks fared fairly well at Dover last week. I know mine did. I picked Jimmy Johnson to win the race, and I think Dan did the same, didn't you? I know you had Jimmy up there at the top. I don't know if he ended up being your A list guy to pick, but
I think I had Gordon,
oh,
so
that's right, you
I
did
did
take.
okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And he scared me a little bit at the beginning of the race. It was nice to see that he came on strong towards the end because that hasn't been his pattern. But yeah, I did okay. I think somewhere in the 300s. So.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Dan is our resident fantasy racing expert here on onpitrow.com and at On Pit Row, I should say, and Dan writes fantasy racing articles for YahooSports.com and NASCAR.com, and you can follow him on Twitter at Fantasy Race, and you should if you're a fantasy racer. In fact, I'm sure you already do if you're a
Even if
fantasy
you're
racer.
not a fantasy racing
You
guy,
should
you
follow
should
him
follow
just
Dan
for
because
fun,
then
'cause
you can impress your friends.
He's a clever guy. All right, so we're going to Kansas now, Dan. Second trip to Kansas this year. Kind of a flatter mile and a half racetrack. Used to be the venue that the go-to guy there for probably the first 3 years that track was there was Greg Biffles. He's still a consideration because he thinks he's still a contender.
Well, the first couple of years they raced there, it was Jeff Gordon and Ryan Newman. They finished 1-2, and then in the first two races, I think Newman won the third race, and Gordon was somewhere in the top five. It took Biffle a little bit to come on strong, but once he did, he strung to quite a few top fives, tens together. Mm-hmm. The last two races haven't been great for him there, but he's been hard to predict this year, and I think he's worth rolling the dice in Group B, especially now that it's getting difficult to stay with the Bush brothers. Most players are getting down to their last couple of allocations and really have to think about where they want to put those drivers in the next 7 weeks. So for that reason, I think you can kind of ignore the last two races at Kansas. You can think about the last couple of races this season. And Biffle's been reasonably strong, so I'd say he's a good pick in Group B. Could possibly finish in the top five, so I think it's going to be difficult to beat some of those Group A drivers for the victory.
Ford came out today with breaking news that they're changing the nose on that Fusion, presumably to help those cars
for next year.
Oh, it's for next year.
For next year.
Well,
yeah.
forget that. Never mind, as Rosanna Dana would say.
Never mind.
So forget. I was just trying to inject a little bit of alleged knowledge into this, but
You blew that.
so okay. So go ahead, Dan. Just tell us who we should be picking in Kansas.
Back to the unrestricted intermediate speedways, the cookie cutter tracks, and I don't think that it's going to be any surprise who the top picks are going to be. Kenseth, Johnson, Kyle Busch, they're leading the points for a reason. You got to run well on these 1.5 and 2 mile tracks, and they do. Kenseth represents a little bit of a risk because he hasn't been winning. He hasn't been running all that well. A couple of races have asterisks next to him, like the accident at Charlotte, but that factors into the handicap as well. You've got to realize those things can happen. But if you saved allocations for Kenseth and Johnson, I think they've got to anchor your Group A team, and whoever you've got the most allocations remaining for which of those drivers, that's who I think you have to go ahead and start this week. But if you don't, I think Gordon's probably a good pick again. He's come on strong recently. I don't think he's got enough consistency to win the championship, but I think he can make it interesting, and the next couple of weeks will be when he makes it interesting. He has been okay on the cookie-cutter tracks the last couple of races. We're not to Talladega yet, where everything's going to just kind of blow up for a lot of drivers. So the next couple of weeks, I think this team's going to be really focused, and he makes a good Group A driver if you can't take Kenseth or Johnson. Down in Group B, we've already talked about Biffle. I think he's got to be the number one ranked driver this week. Martin Truex Jr. had a perfect streak of top 10s going on this track type until we got to Chicagoland, and then he ran fairly strong. I'm not sure exactly what happened to him in that last segment when he dropped out and finished, I believe, somewhere around 15th, but my notes aren't right in front of me. But he ran strong before that, and I think he gets back on track and does okay on the cookie cutters again. So he's who I have ranked second at the moment. Kurt Busch, another all-or-nothing driver, but when you catch him on the right weekend, he's great. Ryan Newman does well on this track type. So I think those are your top picks down in Group B.
Hey,
In
Dan,
C,
Dan, before you get to C, let me ask you about Kurt Busch for a second and the way that you look at him. They changed their crew, their entire crew, over-the-wall guys for last week. Didn't have much more success with the group they brought in. But did that change the way you look at things when they make a change like that that's kind of behind the scenes? I mean, it's not really behind the scenes, but it's part of the race team. Do you figure that in?
I would have thought it would have helped him more than it did. When Johnson did this back in, was it 2011? He went on and finished in the top 5 in the next 2 races when they swapped crews and he got Jeff Gordon's crew. Of course, getting Richard Childress' nationwide crew is not the same thing as getting Jeff Gordon's Cup crew.
Right.
But I figured it couldn't hurt them. I'm not sure that it really helped or hurt. Kurt Busch has been like this all year. He's had a difficult time sustaining top 10 for more than 2 or 3 weeks. And he was just due a bad finish. It doesn't mean that he's going to run good or bad this week. I think you have to take each week kind of separately for him. Although you can you get superstitious about him whenever he starts to accumulate any kind of good fortune because he just hasn't been able to sustain it. Pressure that he puts on himself, I think, is a little bit too much. I've said all along that he tends to overdrive in situations like this, and that seems to be the case more often than not. But last week, that didn't seem to be the case then either. They just missed the setup, and they were due a bad finish. So that monkey's off their back for another week or two. He probably should be okay for another week or two.
Yeah.
All right, so now we have the C drivers. I mean, who's left? We've got, 8 races to go in the season? 7 races to go in the season? Everybody's used up they've used up all their Danica Patricks at this point, right?
I know I have. I used it up in the first 9 races.
Okay,
So,
yeah, there you go.
and that's the problem with getting to change your roster. If you've got Stenhouse and Allmendinger left, they're obviously your best pick. If you don't, you're pretty much in trouble. This is not the time. This is not the type of track at this time of season that you want to get to without some picks for those guys remaining. But if you have, and you've got to make a decision, David Reagan has experience on this track. He's been relatively consistent on the cookie cutters, and in recent races, he's won a fair amount of points for Group C. His 23rd place finish in the Advocare 500 scored 56 points, which was 5th among the Group C drivers. It was 26th in the Geico 400, but he was the 4th best value there. So if you don't have Stenhouse and Allmendinger, you kind of are minimizing your risk this week. Allgaier could fit in the category in the number 51. Team is relatively strong. He's starting to get a little bit of experience. If you really want to roll the dice, he could be another driver to roll the dice with. So those are the drivers I have. And actually, Danica Patrick ranked 3rd at the moment. She hasn't been setting the world on fire, but she's been getting better on the cookie cutter tracks. You could take her, but I think there's definitely risk associated with it. She's not consistent. She doesn't have enough of a track record so you know exactly what she's going to do. But she's been finishing in that same 20s range on the cookie cutter tracks as some of the other better Group C drivers. So she's not going to make my roster, but I wouldn't say avoid her outright.
I can tell you that Allgaier is an ex-ARCA winner at Kansas and looked really stout there when he ran there. So I would kind of lead towards Justin. I think he does well, and he does well when he's in the Midwest like that. That's kind of his neighborhood. So he is Dan Beaver. Dan, we're going to ask you to make a call on who you think is going to win the race, and then we're going to make our erroneous calls and talk about next week.
I'm going with Jimmy Johnson. Kansas took the first two. Johnson will take the next two, and then it'll be up for grabs at Charlotte. I think Johnson wins. I think Kansas finished somewhere back in that 7th place range again, and we've got a points battle on our hands.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm going with Jimmy, too. What do you think, Steve-O?
Well, I don't like to play with the crowd very
of course
well,
you don't.
but I'm going with Joey Logano.
There you go.
I'm going to go with Joey Logano.
Joey's had pretty strong last couple months. I can see that. Beth Ann, who do you like at Kansas? Greg Biffle. All right.
For the Biff.
There we go. We're all front runners except for Steve.
Always.
And he is Dan Beaver. Dan, thanks again for your time this week. Your stuff's always great, and we will talk to you next week when we where are we going next week? Go to Charlotte?
Talladega, isn't it? They go to Talladega
Charlotte.
after this? Charlotte, okay.
Charlotte, that's what I thought, Charlotte. So another mile and a half. We'll talk to Dan next week. Dan, thank you. We read all of Dan's fantasy racing expertise at yahoosports.com and NASCAR.com. Of course, you can listen to his weekly commentary here at On Pit Row. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, guys.